Thank you. My name is Gene Jones, and I'm an executive director for a nonprofit called Cannabis Education. We run two other events other than this one in the cannabis space, the Florida Medical Cannabis Conference and the Florida Industrial Hemp Conference. This particular conference actually came after discussions with Dr. Jeff Konin, who has presented at both of our events. And Dr. Konin came to me, I guess it was after Naples last year, and said, Gene, I've got an idea. I'd like to run a conference related to cannabis and sports. And so that's how this discussion got started. It was because that is the brainchild of this gentleman right here. Yeah, you, sir. And as you can imagine, with the name Cannabis and Sports, it draws attention. And so I commend Dr. Konin for doing this, because we need to have this discussion. We need to talk about how cannabinoids can be used for the treatment of pain, to get folks off of opioids, and also for the treatment of inflammation and the other health effects that cannabinoids have. So again, sir, I commend you. If you allow me, I'm going to make a couple of opening comments. First off, please silence your cell phones. The proceedings, we're recording everything, and we will make those available to everybody post-event. We're going to have a YouTube channel for the conference, as well as compile all of the presentations that you'll see into a PDF document and provide that to everybody post-event. List of attendees. We will be sending out a list of attendees. If you do not want your information released, please let me know, and we'll give you the opportunity to opt out of that list. Bathrooms are out the door, down by the escalators around the corner there. We've got a handout table in the back of the exhibit hall, so if any of you all have literature, you're welcome to use the handout table. Receptions are going to be in the exhibit hall, so our continental breakfasts, our breaks, and the reception tonight will be in the exhibit hall itself. Social media pages, we have started a social media page that's going to be on Facebook and LinkedIn, so I encourage you to join those. Real quickly, this conference wouldn't be possible if it weren't for our sponsors, and our main sponsor is Dr. Konin, so thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Our gold sponsors, Athletes for Care. Anna, thank you very much for helping get the word out and getting us some of the speakers for our program. Greatly appreciated, ma'am. Our silver sponsors and our reception sponsor for last night was the Flowery, and then our reception sponsor tonight is Cureleaf. And then our contributing sponsors, we've got Charles Felix here with Canna News of Florida, as well as some of our other sponsors that you're going to be seeing throughout the event. We had Hemp and Fork. I don't know if you all had any of the hummus last night, but it had hemp hearts on it that they donated. So we're trying to always incorporate something related to hemp in for our events. So with that kind of concludes my opening comments, and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Konin to get us going on this morning's panel. So, sir, all yours.
Want to jump? Oh, I have to jump. Good morning. So I do want to say, Gene is the brainchild of this, and let me tell you why. Yes, it was my idea, but I have a lot of ideas, and most people don't listen. And Gene did. And so, Gene, thank you very much for believing in the idea. And our goal is to watch this grow. We have big plans because we think that this is a popular topic that isn't going away anytime soon. And that it really brings together, I'm not a big fan of this, it takes a village phrase. I think we've worn the phrase out. But in terms of who is involved in sport, from my standpoint, and folks on this panel, we group ourselves in what's called sports medicine. But there's no degree in sports medicine. Sports medicine is a multidisciplinary group of individuals that combine essentially to provide care and well-being for athletes. And our goal through the course of this conference is to bring individuals from these walks of life, from medicine, from healthcare, nutrition, administration, anything we can find, both as speakers and panelists and in our audience to contribute. I think you'll see the structure. I completely stole the structure from Gene's successful conferences that I've attended and spoken at in the past, where there are formal presentations that are short. And I can honestly tell you that many speakers don't like to stay within the time frame of the short presentations because they have a significant amount of expertise to offer, and they may come from a distance to get here. But we find that the presentations are actually most efficient when you get right to the chase and share the critical information, followed by question and answer sessions. And then as you see here, we have panel discussions that are typically lengthier than other panel discussions, but we bring experts in who can offer quite a bit of information. And I can promise you that, and they can attest to this, I've given you no heads up as to what I'm going to ask you. And those of you that were here yesterday for the opening session saw that. We will sort of work off the cuff from the experience that these individuals have and talk about real life problems and real life solutions. When we talk about this topic of cannabis and sport, you'll see all walks of life, right? You'll see a group that says there's no place for it whatsoever. THC, CBD, et cetera. There's zero education in this group. They don't understand where it belongs or doesn't belong. And then you have others who are probably maybe not delivering the ideal message either, that everyone should use cannabis and the world would be a better place. And that doesn't work either, convincing many of the individuals in sports. So somewhere in the middle is where the message needs to be. The problem is, as many of you know, some of us were talking about this earlier at the breakfast, whenever you find compromise leads to some mediocre solution that neither sides are tremendously happy with. But this is where we have to get as a starting point. Yesterday, I walked away with a couple of key themes. One is the importance of education. You have to educate individuals, those that know and those that don't know. But even those that know, few people know everything there is to know in this space. We might know agriculturally about the product. We might know about the delivery system. We might know about administrative rules. But there isn't anybody I've crossed paths with that knows all of this in all different settings. And this is why each panel we have is diverse. We bring the experience of the athlete. We bring the experience of medical and healthcare providers. We bring the experience of administrators who are all in the trenches or have been in the trenches. It can speak firsthand to the benefits, the risks, the challenges. The other piece, we had a concluding part in this yesterday in our panel discussion, was about the user and the message. Is the message the same for a professional athlete versus an intercollegiate athlete versus an amateur athlete versus a minor school-age athlete? And does the sport matter? We heard Kaitlyn tell us how, I'm going to paraphrase, I think, I played better. I was in the zone better. You can't tell me I didn't lose focus. I've done this swing a million times before. And so it's interesting to hear the different perspectives. So we will continue today with this. And just to give you a quick set of the ground rules, if you will, I'll introduce each of our panelists. Start off asking them to give you a brief background introduction of who they are, where they're from, and like I like to say, everybody has a story. Most of us in this space didn't start in this space, unless you're very, very young and you grew up and you knew it right away. But you know, when we went to school, a lot of us, this wasn't a topic that we really talked about educationally, scientifically, but we migrated here somehow. And at some point during this weekend, I'll share with you my story, probably in my presentation, which will be later today on concussion and cannabis. So after the speakers introduce themselves, we'll start with some Q&A sessions. We'll let that roll organically, and we'll certainly be open to questions from all of you out here. What I'll ask you to do is, we do have microphones because this session is being recorded, as are all the sessions. So number one, we'll acknowledge you from here. Please use the microphone. And if you would, it would be appreciative for us to introduce yourself and if where you work, for example, or what you represent. We don't need an entire bio of a product you sell or things of that nature, but just give us a little background of the context of where you're coming from. And just like we've asked our speakers to do, try to keep your statements efficiently so that we have more time for each person that could appropriately address the comments and the questions that you may have. And so without further ado, introduce you to our panel, and again, ask them to just give us a brief background on themselves. So I'm going to start to my immediate right, and this is Dr. Suk. And Dr. Suk, if you would mind going first.
Sure, I don't mind at all. Is this on? Great. Really great to be with you today. My name is Michael Suk. I'm a practicing orthopedic surgeon in Pennsylvania. I specialize actually in orthopedic trauma. I work for a large integrated healthcare system in Pennsylvania. I'm here on behalf of at the invitation of this group to represent the American Medical Association, which I am currently the secretary of the Board of Trustees and also chair a relatively new group that we've been working with is the task force on cannabis. And I think what it does is it represents kind of the larger interest in trying to understand a little bit more, trying to bring further knowledge to the physicians of America, and to really focus, I think, as you pointed out, Jeff, on the education side. I think there is a recognized dearth of widespread education among physicians, and it's complicated, I think, by the number of state laws and the number of interests that are involved in promoting the use, or at least looking to discover further use of cannabis, cannabidiol, and marijuana in general. So it's really great to be here with you, and hope to share with you some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Kevin Morley.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Kevin Morley. I'm the head athletic trainer of the Nashville Predators, the National Hockey League. I'm really excited to be here, and I know there's a couple other of my athletic training brethren both with me here and in the crowd, and so it's nice as a part of the sports medicine delivery system to really all coalesce into this, because I think there's what's exciting for me about this weekend is that we have a real mixed bag of professionals in the room, which I think is really exciting, because we're all being approached all the time with with different interests and certainly different governing bodies that we talked about quite a bit yesterday with with Kaitlyn and with Anna, and we're all kind of who we're beheld to is a little bit different from person to person. So I think it's really interesting as we kind of talk about the big picture of the space in terms of where kind of everybody falls and how we can work together to provide, again, the it's not really a buzzword, but certainly the education certainly is the biggest piece of it. And so, I'm here because, as a member of the sports medicine community, I'm asked all the time, nearly every day, about, products from, the traditional anti-inflammatories that we've been using forever to, manual therapies that myself and my staff are providing, and then to, botanical products and other treatments. And, we have players and athletes from literally all over the world, and so everybody's experience is very different. And so I felt for a long time that's been my job, not necessarily to be able to provide all those services, but at least to be able to speak intelligently about them. And so as CBD specifically became really more visible in the sports medicine space, I was like, oh my God, I have no idea what these people are talking about. And so a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, imposter syndrome. I'm like, well, I need to be able to figure out, I need to be able to just have this conversation, and I really wasn't able to. And so, Jeff was speaking about it in the sports medicine space, and he and I have known each other for years, and I said, I need some help with this. And so then I started a doctorate, and a few years later, here we are. But I'm really excited to talk to, to you as a group, and certainly to our, Dr. Suk mentioned, their task force. And I'm very proud to have been part of the National Athletic Trainers Association Cannabis Task Force that, of course, Jeff funded, not funded, but, initiated. And it was crazy because we went to our National Association meeting a few weeks ago, and we were, we got kind of one of the less opportune time slots on the last day when everybody's checking out of their hotel and on their way to the airport. And they gave us a room, certainly smaller than this, and we had people sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor and people standing in the hallway, because athletic trainers realized that they had absolutely no idea and and came to us on bended knee like, hey, we don't know what we're talking about. We're like, hey, that's okay. Nobody else does either. The nurses don't, and the physicians don't, and the PAs don't, and the OTs don't, and that's okay. And that's, I think, kind of our message, my message in the sports medicine space is that's okay that you don't know. Please just, number one, acknowledge that you don't know, and then just start asking the questions. And so that's kind of what I hope to accomplish, as being part of both this panel, and I'll speak again later today, but also as part of this medical delivery system. I think we need to acknowledge what we know and what we don't know, and then just try and fill in the holes.
Thanks. And I apologize because he is officially Dr. Kevin Morley now. And you see what happens if you ask me a question, I just recruit you for the doctoral program, and that's how you learn. So beware if I see you out there and you have a question for me, you're going down a two-year road of education for me. But thanks, Kevin. And Kevin's right. When we spoke last, it was a couple of weeks ago already in Philadelphia, first time in my life, I kid you not, just like this at a podium. And you try to make eye contact with everybody in the room, you talk to people while you're speaking. There's a person sitting behind me, Indian style. That's how full the room was. They were wrapped all around here. Never seen anything like this in my life. It was a small room, so, right? But that's a very true point. Professor Dr. Paul Borsa.
Good morning. My name is Paul Borsa, and I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Florida. I teach in the Department of Applied Physiology and Kinesiology. We just say APK because there's too many ologies in there. I teach courses related to, I'm also an athletic trainer, certified athletic trainer. I've known Jeff for a long time, just met Kevin today. I'm sorry I missed the session in Philly, but teach in sports medicine area. I also started practicing as an athletic trainer a long time ago, and dealing with injuries, treating injuries. My area of research right now is pain. I'm a pain researcher, primarily how pain affects movement, coming back from injury, and that's kind of my angle into this is trying to find ways to manage pain. And the Consortium for Medical Marijuana Clinical Outcomes Research is a consortium funded by the state of Florida, and they put money into it to start research. And a good friend of mine's the associate director of the consortium, and I said, hey, what do you think if I submit a proposal to study CBD and pain in athletes and look at it in terms of pain control, recovery? And he said, yeah, and he was kind of ho-hum about it. I submitted a proposal and it got funded. Then the pandemic hit and everything shut down. So we're just starting to reemerge with that study. But with that, I saw the real need to kind of change the narrative in terms of how we teach about pain management in sports medicine. I've taught a long time about how we manage pain, looking at the endogenous opioid system and things like that. And my mantra now is opioids to cannabinoids, and how the endocannabinoid system can actually function with cannabinoids to try to help manage pain. And I just started to actually start teaching that in my classes. And students, there's still that big stigma behind it. And to try to change that stigma from, hey, cannabis, your pothead, to no, there's medical cannabis, and this is what it can do for you, has really been interesting and inspiring in terms of seeing people become interested, just like this. So I look forward to today, and thanks for being here.
And last but of course not least, and brought back from a tremendous job on the panel yesterday, I think it's important to understand that we have conferences all the time in medicine and health and sports medicine. And one thing that's usually left out of those conferences is the voice of the athlete. And this is a space where we think it's critically important. We will continue to invite athletes and former athletes who are comfortable talking about their experiences here to join us. And so, Kaitlyn, welcome back. You did a rock star job yesterday, I think was the word we used. So if you would like to reintroduce yourself and your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Athletes for Care for inviting me here this weekend and being able to share my story. I'm a 4-time Paralympian. I competed in wheelchair tennis and kayak and canoe. I'm also a recreational therapist and outdoor program coordinator for a nonprofit in Phoenix called Ability 360. I'm also a USPTA and USPTR wheelchair. I coach tennis, and I've started a wheelchair tennis program in Phoenix. We have over 40 athletes playing wheelchair tennis. And basically, my space here is I was looking for some kind of relief. I was taking 7 different medications to help with my spinal cord injury that I've been on since I was 7 years old. I was involved in an automobile accident, so I sustained a spinal cord injury. And Athletes for Care helped me get a therapeutic use exemption so that I could still compete at an elite level. So,
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a softball question. We talked about the importance of education, so let me ask each of you a question. How do you pronounce endocannabinoid system? Endocannabinoid system. This is important we're on the same page with simple terms that maybe aren't so simple.
I say endocannabinoid system.
I say
That's the professor, endocannabinoid.
endo-
I say endocannabinoid.
Endocannabinoid, but at the end of the day, I don't think there are 2 other things that are defined the same, so either way, I don't think it matters.
So it's okay, it's like potato, tomato, it's okay. Okay, just making sure. Okay, Dr. Suk, can you start by sharing with us, in my readings of some of your background,
Yeah.
we have a similar role by title only, in that for the National Athletic Trainers Association, I was a chair of a task force on cannabinoids, and you're the chair of a task force somewhat similar in title for AMA. Can you talk more about the goals and the findings to date in that role?
Sure. So, the AMA is a large, I'll give you a little bit of background on the AMA. It's a large national organization that represents physicians across America, about 300,000 members. It's really the largest single voice for physicians across America. And the way we make policy for the AMA to take particular stances on science and things like that is it goes through a House of Delegates. Several years ago, the House of Delegates asked that we recognize the problem with a lack of education or consistent education among physicians on the issue of cannabis, and a task force was asked to be created. So the task force was created by the AMA Board of Trustees and asked me to chair that, which represents physicians from all across America. We have about 30 representatives from all of the state medical societies and also specialty societies that sit on the task force, in addition to their executive directors. So it's really a broad scope, wide-ranging set of voices and eyes, I think, on this issue. Specific to the topic, it's not cannabinoids in the general context, but it's more specifically located or specific to marijuana and cannabis, specific cannabis research. And the purpose of the task force is to identify what is the best evidence, how best to address disseminating that evidence, in trying to stay within the lane of looking at the science and providing the scientific education for physicians across America. It's always touchy when you get into this issue of cannabis because it has so many broad-ranging applications. It's not just what it is, how it works, and what's the science and education, but it always touches upon aspects of politics and emotion and other things like that. So the very narrow lane that we're trying to swim right now is really on focusing on what is the best levels of evidence, how best to communicate that to physicians, so that we can, as you pointed out earlier, create a foundation from which we can then go on into the other discussions.
Was there anything in your background that led to you being asked, let alone chairing this group?
As an orthopedic surgeon who specializes in trauma, does a lot of sports medicine as well, I think it was a more natural fit because I do have patients, it's really on a daily basis, that come in for a wide variety of conditions that ask for recommendations, let's say, on uses and potential uses of cannabis-related items. Pain relief is oftentimes a big one, the best conversations that I have is usually to start with the fact that we don't know enough, but it also doesn't seem like it's going to provide too much harm, and if you give it a try, I think it's actually worth doing, and I'd love to hear back from you on an anecdotal basis as to whether it works. And so I have a good range of patients out there today that really give us, some of that important anecdotal feedback. Some, tell me that their CBD use has knocked the pain out of the park, and they say, it's gone, I love it. Others come back and say, I tried it, didn't really do much. And so, I'm an N of one in terms of my research gathering, and I think it's important to continue to grow that body of evidence and literature and support movements that continue to either financially support research but that give us a much broader scope of what's happening out there in the current patient arena.
I know some of you out here are trademark gurus, and if you're going to beat me to the punch of the N of 1, please do it together with me, because that seems to be the phrase. In the absence of good clinical trials, it's a lot of N of 1s. And the N of 1s, as we spoke about yesterday, are what's driving policy change at state levels. So Kevin, your N of 1s come from all over the world. Yeah. And so...
well, hold on, can I just comment on what he just said?
You can say anything you like.
Yeah. So, I think, dissemination is, the brother, sister of education, right? Because, where I sit in the sports medicine space and medical delivery system is, collaborating with sports medicine physicians and orthopedic surgeons, as part of this delivery system. And so I'll ask often, we'll say, well, what do you say when your patients, I'll ask the physicians I work with, and I'm not really leading them into anything necessarily, I just kind of want to know where they stand, and I'll say, what do you say when your patients ask you about CBD or cannabis? Now, I live in Tennessee, and there's no legal cannabis use of any kind in Tennessee, so we don't really talk about cannabis as much in Tennessee, but say, what do you say when they ask you about, using CBD? And, more often than not, the response is, there's not enough research about it, so I tell them that they can use whatever they want, but I can't comment on it medically. And, and I understand that answer and I understand that perspective, but I have a hard time not jumping out of my tennis shoes because, what I want to tell them is that's not the right answer. And so if your answer is, I don't know enough about it to comment on it as a physician, I have all the respect in the world for that answer. Because there's a lot of things as an athletic trainer that I don't work with female athletes. I don't really know a lot about, the female athlete triad. There's a lot of things in female athletes that I don't work with. And so if people ask me questions, I tell them, this is what I learned in school 20 years ago, but the reality of it is that I don't work with it in that space. I don't know enough about it to answer your question, but I can help you find somebody who does. So I think from the perspective of the dissemination relative to cannabis, and I understand that, this task force is looking at cannabis specifically, but even in the cannabinoid space is that there is research, and what I always tell people is that there is research. It's just not in the journals that you're reading. It doesn't mean it's not there. It means you have to work a little bit harder. So maybe it's not coming up in your Netflix as like suggested for you. Maybe you have to actually search for it, but I promise you it's there. And we just did this task force, as we mentioned, and I've done a couple presentations like this to a variety of different groups, and I'll pull up a PubMed search. You type in cannabis, and he got 24,000, I got 27,000 hits, and they're not all meta-analyses, but they're also not just they're also not just magazine articles either from like people. So there is research and there is content, and I understand that we need to, vet the research. I understand all of that, and and it's not all conclusive. I understand that there's a broad spectrum, cannabis stroke, right? There's a broad spectrum of research and information out there, but let's just identify that it exists. Like that's number one. So from a medical perspective, it does exist. You might need to work a little harder to find it. Kudos to your group for being able to disseminate it, and so it is there. And let's just identify that if the practitioner that you're working with isn't the right person to give it or to speak on it, that's okay. Because we can't all be experts in everything. And so let's just collaborate to find out, resources and, repositories where the information is already aggregated.
Kevin, this may be the beginning of a wonderful discussion, and I don't have any issue or problem with what you're saying at all. I think that the question comes when we want to consider the derivatives of cannabis as a drug, right? That's where it gets a little bit more gray in terms of the physician mindset. So it's not, I think most physicians would probably readily agree that their background in education, medical school probably did not bring them through a whole series of courses to a level of Ph.D. understanding of cannabis. I'm the first to admit that was not part of my education and training. But continuing, I think it's important because people ask about it. But when asked about a particular medication or a particular intervention that might be considered in the drug sphere, then there is a whole regulatory pathway that's associated with that. And putting the onus on research and kind of doing those things on the physician, I think is fair, but at the same time, it needs to be, in a sense, if considered a drug, regulated. And those bodies, I think, are still considering what to do with it. Now, I had a discussion during this morning about, status of drugs that have greater than 0.3% considered to be a class 1 medication or a Class 1 drug. That may or may not be fair, or may not be to the same level of agreement in this group, but unfortunately, that's what it is. And that puts severe restrictions, as you know, on what we can do from a research standpoint. So as a professional organization, I think that there are many, many things that we do in medicine today that aren't necessarily regulated as a drug. Nutraceuticals, vitamins, things like that. We say these are things that are not necessarily regulated, and this is the commentary that we would have, is I don't know enough about it. But it's very hard to, I think, say, but I do know that there is an expert in the field, and he or she can take care of all the issues that you have. So, to some degree, I agree that there is a dearth of research. There's an important aspect of dissemination, but I think we're all agreeing that the level of evidence or level of research we have out there isn't quite there yet, but we're getting closer. And the important thing is the conversation is happening. Yep.
Now, food for thought. Kevin said that you have to work a little harder because the research that's out there might not be in the medical journals that one typically reads. We also have an awful lot of people that don't even read medical journals. And I would argue that People magazine is visible to everybody in the checkout line at every grocery store. So for those of you that have writing skills, think about that. Reach out to those general journals for the layperson, or general magazines, and see if you can contribute articles to those so that people understand and read. They can't be biased, as we said earlier, in one direction or the other, but that's the way to send education as well, because the topic will be on the front cover of many of those magazines, I promise you.
Yeah, Jeff, I would just say that, and I think it's very fair to say from a dissemination of awareness, that's exactly right. But I don't think there's a person in this room who wants their physician to be educated and they're by People magazine, right? so I definitely think from a communication standpoint, but again, recalling what the foundation of medical science is, it's not going to be People magazine we're into.
It's hard to follow that quote. That's awesome. This is the longest time we've ever kept a professor quiet. So, Dr. Borsa, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that when it comes down to what it actually does and what are the benefits of using cannabis or cannabis derivatives, is we really don't know. And I know someone's going to talk tomorrow or this afternoon about the mechanisms, but we really don't know what those mechanisms are. And we know from animal studies what it does. We can derive a lot of information from those models, but that's not humans. And we really need to find out what does cannabis do in the human body, and how do we get those effects that are beneficial to us. And I think that we need to start this revolution of research. It just has started. It's been around, but mainly, like I said, in animals, and now we're starting to make the transition to looking at it in humans. From my standpoint, I really got a high dose of regulation involved with this, because when I got the grant to study CBD, I thought I could just go ahead and submit an IRB proposal and it'd get accepted at the university, and because to me it was a nutritional supplement. You could go down to the store and buy it. They said, no, you have to go to the FDA and get an investigational new drug for using CBD. And I was like, are you crazy? So I had to write an application to the FDA and go through the whole process of explaining to them what I'm using CBD for, the indications, and so forth and so on. And it really took me almost a year to get the IND, investigational new drug approval from them. And they knew exactly what CBD does. I think they were just messing with me and wanted to see if I knew what I was talking about. But from that standpoint, I think we really need to move forward with that, and we need to move past CBD. There's over 100 cannabinoids in the cannabis plant, and we really don't know what those other cannabinoids do. We know what THC does, we know what CBD does, but there's a whole bunch of other minor cannabinoids and terpenes that we don't really know exactly what they do. So we need to do a whole host of research. Thankfully, there's agencies like the Consortium for Medical Marijuana Clinical Outcomes Research in Florida that is funneling money into a system for research, and I'm optimistic that there's going to be more and more money and influence and motivation for people to start studying this.
So Professor Borsa threw out IRB, IND, FDA.
I said
and this is our regulatory world. So let me tell you a quick story about what relates to what he's sharing. I had a similar situation. The IRB, for those that don't know, is at a university. There's a body of individuals who regulate studies that we do to protect human subjects. It's called the Institutional Review Board. And so I, like you, submitted a study to test a topical CBD. And they review it, and they come back and they give us feedback. They approve or they don't approve. They query some of our statements. For example, one of the statements that came back to me is, in the informed consent, the document you're going to show them what you're going to do with research to their body, you must let them know there is a risk of addiction. I said, for like a lotion I'm putting on their knee of CBD? And so we are also dealing with individuals that are approving or denying the studies that need to be educated as well. And after I wrote back to them, what are you talking about, basically? I went to lunch, and on the menu, I could order CBD hamburger. And then later at night, we're at an ice cream shop, and there was a CBD flavored ice cream. But I couldn't do a controlled study putting CBD lotion on somebody's knee. And these are the types of regulations. These are real. These are what we deal with to have these studies approved. And so when you say, well, where is the research? We're trying. Many people are trying, and some are a little more successful than others, but the classification of THC in a Schedule I is inhibiting to us. And even the mere fact, even though CBD now is in a different classification, the individuals that approve it really don't understand what that is. CBD studies are hard to do. CBN right now, they think is the next THC, won't let us do studies on that. And so it's really restricting for those of us that have the abilities and the understanding of how to do research to actually carry it out. Kaitlyn, you are an N of 1. What do you think about hearing these?
As an athlete, as a person living with a disability, as a rec therapist, I work with a lot of folks with varying disabilities. It's frustrating to hear this side, because to know that there could be something out there that could potentially help somebody and change their life for the better versus taking pharmaceutical drugs for a lot of ailments that we have. It's frustrating that this is that we're stuck here and we can't do more research. As a rec therapist, we're at my job, and as a person with a spinal cord injury, I have totally felt the benefits of not only CBD, full spectrum, THC, but it's changed my life. And so I love to be able to share that with others, but I'm also hesitant because of where we are at in this space, and we just don't have the research or don't have enough information. And
so Dr. Borsa talked about, we have a body of work on animal studies, and we're trying to transition to human studies. If you were still competing on Team USA,
yeah.
Would you actively participate in a study of this kind? Because we don't want just general human studies too. In our population, we want to see what happens to those who are in an athletic population. How does this impact performance?
I totally would. Thanks to Athletes for Care, I have the therapeutic use exemption, so I can go and compete and get drug tested while I'm in competition, and I could have marijuana in my system and I would pass. Somebody without a TUE would not, obviously. So I have a...
Okay, I think, first of all, kudos to all the things that you're doing. Congratulations to Anna and Athletes for Care. I've had a chance to know Anna now for the better part of a couple of years, and the great work that she's doing in the space. I would say a couple things. One is the research frontier, I think, hopefully is about to open up, and we were just talking about this morning. So in March of 2022, this year, there was a Senate bill introduced by Senator Feinstein. Senate, I have it written down here, 253, which passed unanimously in the Senate, that would open up research. He's shaking his head. Someone's shaking his head, so maybe he disagrees with me. Well, I'm not sure what you're frustrated by, but I'd love to hear more. But I think that the fact that it passed the Senate now has to go to the House in order to go through the legislative steps to get there. But the purpose of it is to expand the ability to do human research and to open up the doors on that as well. And so I think that there may be some light at the end of the tunnel. It may not be coming as quickly as we all want, but it's really the first evidence that I've seen that there's going to be at least some national interest in opening up the research aspect of it. As far as the TUE is concerned, I think that's great that we have those. Those are in their own form of their own clinical type of study, right? So those who have a TUE can be looked at and spoken to, and some evidence can be generated as to performance enhancement. But I think the other larger picture of just this world of CBD and scientific regulation is that we would love to isolate the use of it just for specific entities and for specific purposes. But if you think about it, it really is our responsibility to have an understanding of its effects on things like children or pregnancy or breastfeeding women and things like that in order to get a full spectrum of the safety and efficacy of this, which is why I think the regulatory pathway, whether it's in the university for an IRB or whether it's through an IND, and new drug investigation as a class 1, those are kind of the safety net acronyms that we use in order just to make sure that whatever we put out and promote as a drug is regulated from a safety and efficacy standpoint. And I'm not here as a FDA proponent or a regulator or anything like that, but mainly to kind of showcase the fact that as we go down this road, and if we want to learn more about this, there has to be more studies, but there is a pathway that ultimately is still set up as a safety net. As much as we may like it or not, there's a reason for it to be there.
Dr. Sook, I've recently read some peer-reviewed papers that talk about the impact of THC in the system under anesthesia. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to this in your practice? How is that screened for, and is that a concern of yours?
It's interesting. It's only, if anyone's had surgery or gone through a small procedure, the anesthesiologist comes to you and takes a brief history. I'm seeing more and more now that THC or the asking about usage of marijuana is actually part of our standard screening process now. And that's largely because of these studies that are showing there is an effect, an interference effect, and I'm not sure exactly to what degree. But if it can have potential damaging consequences when you're under anesthesia, then it is part of your standard medical history taking at this point. So I've seen it to a much greater degree now.
For those of you that are unaware, what the studies are showing is that, and it's very inexact, it doesn't really boil down to the amount of THC in your system, but that 3 things happen. 1, it's more difficult to put you to sleep. 2, it's more difficult to wake you back up. And 3, there's up to a 3.5 times greater risk of stroke, heart attack, things of that like coming out of surgery. Now, they might be small percentage numbers, but those are pretty significant. And so, as mentioned, it's more of a screening tool now. And what I would advise you, for those of you working with athletes, this is one thing we do, is to let them know, basically, number 1, if it's in your system, it's a greater risk when you have surgery. But secondly, when the anesthesiologist comes in and asks you that question, that's not the time to mask and not be honest with them and transparent that there may be something in your system. They need to be aware of this. We need a microphone if you don't mind. No problem.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Just a quick question. I wanted to know if that was someone under the influence, or whether it's THC or CBD, if they used that day, and that's when the anesthesia study was done, or if it's just days later, a week later.
Yeah, so the studies simply identify it's in the system, and there's a greater risk the more acute it is, obviously, but it can also be a small amount from a chronic user that's been in there for a long period of time that will influence that. And I'm happy to share with you afterwards the citation if you want to read it. It's not terribly exciting material, but the conclusion is good. So, yeah.
Yeah, hey Jeff, before we get past the research discussion, I wanted to bring out one of the really important things that we know about research in cannabis is that it's almost impossible to achieve to the level of what the average practicing clinician and researcher wants. And there's reasons for that. It's a plant. It's not just one substance. It's not just THC and CBD and the other cannabinoids. There's terpenes, of course, flavonoids. So each and every plant is heterogenetic. It's different. Each and every patient also is different in their response to cannabis and all the various products in the plant. So to me, when you look at really what conventional pharma research is, it's the isolation of a particular molecule or chemical and its effect on, the patient, both side effects, good effects, bad effects. Cannabis, on the other hand, has been utilized for years in society throughout history. So there's a certain body of research on it already just by the usage of cannabis through the years. So my contention is we'll never get to the point where research is going to discuss what we cannabis clinicians know is the entourage effect of all the cannabinoids. So my answer always to this is pharma, do what you do. You want to isolate cannabinoids, you want to study them, do it over there. I have no issues with it, but don't bug me with what I'm doing over here in treating patients with whole entourage plant product. When you find out what you find out over there about CBC and CBG and CBN and all the other cannabinoids, let my botanists know so that they can breed that into my plants, right? Because I want it all, right? So to me, that's always going to be the challenge to the extent of satisfying the research body that people want.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dr. Gordon, because right now, many of the institutional review boards want to see the certificate of analysis of an isolated cannabinoid. And you're talking about a pharmaceutical grade drug, essentially, with respect to that. And that's one of the challenges that we do have, and we'll show them, well, this product for here is, for example, 95% isolate CBD, and it has also whatever else is in it, and then that's not acceptable because there's that small risk that it's not just a CBD isolate. But not to beat a dead horse, but I want to beat the dead horse because this is really our biggest wall in front of us. I'll give you another example. So Dr. Gordon was part of a grant proposal that I put together, and what I really wanted to know was, is there an impairment with THC in your system? And most people will talk about the immediate impairment, right? Okay, your reaction times are slower when you're driving, right? Or whatever it might be. But what I wanted to know was, is there an impairment 18 hours later, 12 hours later? And the reason was I was involved with a lawsuit where there was an employee who was using medical marijuana nightly, low dose. The next day at work, late afternoon, they fell off a ladder and they got hurt. And their employer was perfectly fine, had knowledge of their use of medical marijuana, and was on record as saying, no problem with me, even though they don't have federal protection in the employment setting, they're a better worker now. It's okay. But what happened was when it came time to pay the health benefits, it was denied by the insurance company because that person tested positive for THC in their system. And so the question they asked me as an expert witness was, is it possible that this person was still impaired acutely 12 to 18 hours later? And I see a lot of you shaking your head, no, 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 no. But this is the analogy to athletics. And this is the question I'm asked all the time. If we play on Saturday, when should I stop taking my marijuana so that I'm not impaired on that game day? And this is a question that's, quite frankly, it's not been answered. The long-term or the non-acute, if any, impairment levels that from something in your system, because when we test and something pops up over the sensitivity level, it's just called a positive test and you have this in your system. But one of the things I advise the athletes on, you have to understand, you could not smoke for 2 weeks, but 2 weeks later you run the red light, you roll through the stop sign, and you're pulled over. You're not that average student at that university. You're on the front page and you tested positive for driving under the influence now. And so at some point in time, the average population, and for us, the athletes, we have to be able to identify a correlation of impairment, if it exists, longevity-wise, longitudinally down the road, not just acutely from short-term intake.
It's a really excellent example of, some of the things that we as physicians face all the time when it comes to medications and needing to understand the pharmaceutical profile of anything that we would prescribe. If you were in a physician's office and they said, hey, I want you to take these drugs, and there was scientific evidence that it would impair you for the next 36 hours or you shouldn't get on the ladder, you'd expect the physician to say, hey, I'm going to tell you, the evidence shows that I don't think it's good to be at heights or to climb a ladder or to do something overly manual for a period of 3 days. The fact that we don't know the answer to the basic question you had, and it sounds like it's being litigated, which is is an unfortunate way to figure out the evidence, speaks more to the fact that we need to have that if we're going to consider it to be a drug. right? And that's why I think that as difficult as all of this is, I think it's still probably the most appropriate pathway to go forward. We may disagree on that, but I'd be curious to know, what advice would you give to your patient who asked for medication that needed to be on a ladder in 12 hours, and based on what evidence?
Dr. Gordon, hold 1 second, if you don't mind. We'll start there. Who has the mic? And I
Yeah.
think then also there's a question there, and then you're third in line.
Hi, my name is Nick DiFrancesco. I'm CEO of PureWell. We do custom formulated pharmaceutical products as well with CBD, as well other anti-inflammatories inside of it. We talk to a lot of athletes, a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, and isolating cannabinoids as well as making custom formulations. A lot of the athletes that we talk to, professional or not, collegiate, also use cannabis for other reasons, for body breaking down, for actually enhancing themselves through performance, and not that it's in their body hindering them, it's actually helping them through that athletic endeavor, whatever they're doing. I mean, we talk to a lot of NHL players, Riley Cote is someone we have on Empire, and a lot of other players, Kyle Turley, all these guys are known in athletics to know, and all of them talk about how it helps them after practice, during practice. It's not hindering them. It's not giving them the ability not to be able to focus or do something. It's actually helping their body from breaking down. And it's keeping them away from using traditional pharmaceuticals in a way where they are addicted to opiates, or they're given to side effects of traditional medication. And that's what I've been doing for many years, is legitimizing cannabis on a medical level. And that's what PureWell is about. So it's hard because we've been trying to forward this narrative for a long time. I talked to a lot of doctors, from rheumatologists all the way down, and everyone's always has the same argument about, how can we prove this? But anecdotally, we know that it does help. We're always talking about the negatives, and we always talk about the positives, but let's talk about what people are really using it for, to get off of traditional medication, because it's working for them. And so if it's, I got athletes come to me constantly and talk to me. Michael Moore was in the office the other day. Again, a 4-time champion boxer said, changed my life. Now that he's no longer fighting. So, it's just hard. And there is a lot of, when you say full spectrum, obviously you have CBN, CBD, all these different things, but using and combining it with other formulas, other anti-inflammatories, catechin, bacillin, boswellia, curcumin. There's other things that you can use in combination with no side effects for cannabis that are very, very effective. If you ever want to know about it, we have a booth here. We'll talk to you all about it. But I don't see that side, and I talk to a lot of doctors. I have so many more people saying, it's not about the hindering, it's that I need it to get through my athletic performance. You're using it to get through what you're doing. I mean, this is insane. And instead, no. I mean, I have a patient yesterday that talked about how they were denied for cancer treatment, terminal, and Medicare won't give them any more funding for being in hospice and everything else in hospitals, because they're using THC. And it's the only thing that'll work. And the doctors go, I don't have anything else for you. This is what we have for you. This is what we know. So it's just, this is the merry-go-round that we hear every day, and we're going to.
You lost me when you said rheumatologists on down. Who's down?
Well, no. I mean, yeah. I meant to say. Well, sometimes when I talk to, we'll talk to chiropractors and podiatrists, and then you have rheumatologists on the other side, and there's always that argument of physicians and who. Every walk of life, every type of patient is benefiting from cannabinoids, not just autoimmune diseases, not just aches and sprains and broken bones. I'm just trying to say gynecologists, oncologists. I mean, it's just everybody.
Thank you. Question over there? Or comment?
Can I just comment before I think as we stay in the space of, performance, I think we also can acknowledge that there's a lot of things that affect people's performance, right? And so your diet affects your performance, and certainly your alcohol use affects your performance, and your level of fatigue, and whether or not you just have a new baby at home. And there's a lot of things that affect people's performance. And so, when we work with athletes, we're always trying to mitigate the things that affect, have detrimental effects on performance. We're trying to find the things that help boost performance. within the confines of whatever our governing bodies may be, of course, and then we're trying to mitigate the things that have a decrement to performance. And so, for cannabis users, identifying how that affects that person is going to be very, very personal and very specific to that person. And so, because there's so much variety in the spectrum, because each product is so different, as we're mentioning, specific to the cannabis space, but even in the cannabinoid space, less of THC probably has less an effect on their performance issues. But in the cannabis space, because it's so different from person to person, because everybody's metabolism is so different, their endocannabinoid tone is different, you'll give the same product to certain people, and people will come back and say that they had, give it to 5 people, and they've had 5 different results. And so we face that in the sports space where people talk about, well, I have trouble sleeping. My buddy took CBD and it helps him sleep, and I took CBD and it did nothing, so it didn't work. So, well, I don't know that it didn't work is really the right way to frame it. I think it didn't have that effect on you is really the way that you should perceive it. The same way that a glass of wine will have a different effect from person to person, or a shot of vodka, or a pizza. So I think what we have to, as we frame the discussion, and again, I live in the sports performance space, and so, my parents who are baby boomers and having all their joints replaced, like their performance is different. Like, they want to play with their grandkids, and my mom wants to go out on her boat on the lake. Like, so everybody's performance is different, and so it's our responsibility on the medical delivery system and the sports performance system to identify, well, what do you want to do today, and how are your pains or your neuropathies or your other medications, right? There's so much that goes into the conversation, but to just bring it back to the sports performance space specifically, I think it's important to identify that there are a lot of things that affect your ability to perform at a high level. Cannabis may be one of them. Alcohol certainly is one of them. And so, like Jeff mentioned, the guy or the gal on the front page of the paper, or the school paper, or the website, or whatever, you'd like to think that they're probably not going to have a bottle of wine the night before the national championship game, because they know how it's going to affect them. And so I think the onus is certainly on, of course, the providers in whatever state you're in and the legal framework that governs you, but specific to the person, you need to decide how this affects you. And I know that maybe I can have this much wine or this much pizza and feel okay the next day, but if I indulge in either one of those things, or God forbid both, I know how that's going to affect me too. So my performance might be sitting up here and speaking with you, or my performance might be, working at an NHL game, or my performance might be parenting. And so all of those things are performance, and lots of things that we do in our life have an effect on our performance. And so I think, part of what we're learning here is that it's going to affect everybody differently, which is very hard. And I have to say, from the medical side, is to say, I know if you take 2 Celebrex, this is what's going to happen, as a broad generalization, right? So I worked with a very homogeneous group of people. It's all men. They're like 18 to 35, no comorbidity, like nothing, right? So it's a pretty easy group in that sense. So I know that if you take 2 Celebrex, or if you take one, or 1 Mobic, or 2 Tylenol, like, we have a pretty good idea of how that's going to affect you. And unfortunately, this space becomes far more difficult because I don't really know. And again, I'm not speaking about in Tennessee, and obviously there's plenty of cannabis in Nashville, and there's plenty of cannabis on Broadway. But from a legal perspective, obviously, it's not something that's permitted. But, we don't know. I don't know how CBD is going to affect you. I don't know how CBN is going to affect you. It helps some people sleep. It doesn't help other people sleep. So when people say, well, I want to try CBN because it helps people sleep, I'll say, my recommendation oftentimes is CBN often does help people sleep. I don't know if it's going to help you or not. I'm fairly confident if we pick a good, clean, safe product, you pick a good, clean, safe product, I'm pretty sure it's not going to hurt you, right? I think for me, it also boils down to, like, do no harm, right? So there's a safety issue first, and once we've cleared that hurdle, now let's talk about performance. And so if fatigue is your performance, or certainly a performance decrement, a performance inhibitor, then we can say, all right, well, how are we going to battle that? And so now we're going to talk about breathing, and we're going to talk about yoga, and we're going to talk about mindfulness, and we're going to talk about your, getting rid of all your chew and your coffee before bed and all those things, right? So certainly it's a cornucopia of things that we're that we're addressing. But just sorry to take so long on this, but I think it's important that somebody has a lot of alcohol and they're fun, and somebody has a lot of cannabis and they're a pothead, right? And so I think we've all shared in that at some level. And so, but if we destigmatize that, which which we're not going to do sitting here, right? But if we take that piece out of it, well, let's just talk about what's Kaitlyn trying to do? She's trying to perform better, and she's trying to treat her symptoms and her neuropathies, which are performance decrements. And so she's going to learn, and other athletes will learn, and other performers will learn how each product, whatever they're choosing, affects them and affects their performance. And so I think that's the thing that, this is the cannabis and sports discussion, and so I think we need to kind of look at it that way.
Now, take a deep breath for a second, relax. Was there a period anywhere saying that? I want to ask you another question, actually.
All right.
And this is free advice for everybody here. When I come across people in this industry and they learn what I do in the space, and they have a product, they give me an aggressive sales pitch and a push why their product is the latest and greatest and the best thing out there. I don't work with a professional sports team, so I imagine your phone, your emails, they're lighting up and everyone's trying to get to you first. They have a friend who has a friend to get to you, and you need to use this for your professional athletes. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for people in that space that want to send that message to you in an appropriate way that you'll listen and maybe even begin to entertain what they have?
So believe it or not, I do have the ability to give a short answer. The short answer is that I'm going to talk about that at 1:30. But not to dodge it completely, is that, we'll pretend that this conversation, which does happen quite frequently, is a cannabinoid product. And so safety, right? Do no harm. And so I want to understand that your product is safe first. And whether that's a knee brace, or whether that's a cannabinoid product, or whether that's a pharmaceutical, I want to make sure that your product is safe. And so I have people send me samples so I can look at it and vet it oftentimes personally. But I look for COAs, and I look for a COA. I have a slide that you'll see later, like COA red flags. Like, there's some things that I look at when I vet a COA.
Tell them what COA is. Tell them what COA is.
Oh, sorry.
Another acronym.
Sorry. So the COA is a certificate of analysis, ideally coming from a third-party independent lab. So if you're going to produce a cannabis product, a cannabinoid product, you're going to send it up for third-party testing. It's like, here, I made these brownies, they're really good. Well, I want to look at it from a safety perspective first, right? And then we'll discuss if your brownies are actually good or not. So that's the first thing that I'm looking at, honestly. And so, because players ask me all the time, what do you think about this? And it has to be safe first. And there's the WADA, USADA, all that stuff that we've addressed that, and I'll bring it up again just kind of briefly later. But safety.
Thanks. Your presentation this afternoon is 20 minutes. Just to make sure that.
Got it. Well, I just got 5 minutes of it done. So.
Did you still have a question? You've been waiting patiently. I don't know where the microphone is.
Yeah, so it's not really a question. It's kind of a statement, and it's a little bit of my frustration and my point of contention. I'm Josephine Canella-Crail. I'm a licensed medical social worker. My background is in hospice and palliative care. And I have worked extensively since before Florida had a program legislatively to educate our lawmakers and to help implement our program. I have been licensed as a clinical social worker for nearly 30 years. And at the heart of my work has always been to protect marginalized and vulnerable populations. And my biggest frustration, and I think my point of contention, is the Schedule I status of cannabis. And what that does is it sets up a framework where this whole program that we have in Florida really is medically discriminatory towards those who choose a state legal medical option as opposed to someone who selects a traditional pharmaceutical drug. And a lot of it goes back to the, level of impairment. But when we talk about do no harm, when I get a prescription drug, I turn it to the side and it has a warning on it. And it says, don't operate a heavy equipment or a motor vehicle until you know how this substance affects you. Well, why don't we treat medical cannabis patients the same way? Why don't we work together in that therapeutic relationship and help people understand, you know, this might affect you differently than it affects this other person? Why don't we take that relationship and empower people to take their health and well-being back? You know, I've been operating in this space for 10, 12 years now, and folks know of the work that I've done, and the biggest contacts that I get are people like Kaitlyn who have started using cannabis therapeutically, and they've been able to come off of all of these other drugs. Then something happens and they get drug tested at work, and guess what? They've worked for that company for 10 years. All of their performance evaluations are superior, but they have positive status for THC and they get fired. That is medical discrimination. So at the heart of the cannabis conversation really is cannabis does not meet the criteria of a Schedule I drug. It just doesn't. It can be used safely under medical supervision. It doesn't have a high propensity of abuse. I started out as a substance abuse therapist. Is there a propensity for abuse? Heck yeah, of course, you could abuse anything. Is there a high propensity? No. It doesn't even meet the status, and because of these prohibitionist drug laws, we are trapped in a system where we can't even effectively study this plant, and we are doing great harm to our people.
I think Dr. Sook addressed that well earlier about the restrictions with the research, and obviously the way the schedule is right now, nobody in any university is going to approve and say, well, yeah, Jeff, you can, if you want to do a heroin study, you can do that. If you want to do LSD and take 50 patients here and 50 here without it, and that's where right now basically marijuana is grouped in, and so and until we do see those changes from a classification perspective, our hands are tied regardless of what we think and what we believe.
Yeah, I would just add that, first of all, you bring up a very important issue of the legal status of cannabis and its potential negative effects downstream, both on minoritized communities, et cetera. And I just share with you that, you know, I shared with you our policymaking process through the AMA, and new AMA policy this year that was passed was our support for the expungement of those criminal records in a state that subsequently legalizes the use. So if you were, you know, you had it on your criminal record that you were using marijuana for some, at that point, illegal purpose, and if it becomes legal for certain uses in the state, then we support the expungement of those records for all those people. Interestingly, you know, this goes on into the medical professional area as well, and that some state regulatory bodies, state licensing boards, look at past criminal record. And this could be a potential detriment to those who are in the space. So 100% support the fact that those should be expunged as well, and that it shouldn't be used as a reason not to get into medical school, as a reason not to get a license, et cetera, et cetera. So I think on that point, with regard to you know, the issue of health equity and the issue of decriminalization or expungement of records, it might surprise you to hear that the American Medical Association stands 100% behind those ideas.
Let me share with you a story that you might want to use in the future as well. It'll just reinforce some of those thoughts. So it's Super Bowl Sunday, and I have a bunch of friends over, and Paul Borsa is one, and Kaitlyn's another. And Paul knocks on the door of my house, and he walks in with his case of beer, and Kaitlyn walks in with her medical marijuana, right? And we watch the game. Goes into like usually long halftime show, right? So it goes late into the night, and Paul pretty much polishes off his case. All right, Paul, sorry, thanks for being a good sport in the story. And Kaitlyn does her thing that she does every night. She feels great. And they leave. And what I didn't tell you was they both work for, let's say UPS. And so Super Bowl Sunday, Monday morning, they have to get up and go to work and load their truck and deliver the packages, right? So Kaitlyn, she wakes up, she feels great. She gets out there, she loads the truck, She makes her deliveries. My God, it's only 3:30, the truck's empty. I can go back to the warehouse. I can put a few more things on and make some deliveries. People are ecstatic. They didn't think their package was coming till tomorrow on Tuesday, and she does her job, right? Paul wakes up, the alarm goes off. He's like, oh, snooze. Goes off again. He finally rolls out of bed, right? His head's pounding from the hangover from the beer. Takes a shower, he gets dressed, his shirt's half untucked, he's driving into work. Every box he picks up to put on a truck, his head hurts more. He starts driving, the sun's glaring in his eye, his head is pounding. 4:30 rolls around, his truck is half full, he hadn't even begun to get all the deliveries out. Fast forward the next morning. Ding-a-ling-a-ling, random drug test. Paul passes the drug test. He's fine. Kaitlyn's fired. THC in her system. This goes back to the whole impairment thing that we're talking about. What is the actual outcome in a system? There are white papers that are now coming out of Australia. Dr. Sook, you might have an interesting thought on this. But the question is, if you have a surgeon whose career is ending due to tremors from, say, Parkinson's, and they could potentially benefit from a low-dose THC, oops, I'm throwing pens around now. I got them ready to go. Is it safer? Is it safer and helpful to prolong a successful surgeon's career when you can control the tremors, regardless of whether it's a pharmaceutical medicine now or if it's a new, say, 20-to-1 CBD THC that has no euphoric effect, it's washed out, but the person is receiving the benefits of the tremor being reduced, and they can continue their career successfully. Is this an approach we should take? You could say the same thing for somebody driving a vehicle who can no longer drive because of tremors, and this can control the tremors, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, again, it just boils down to the classification of what we're talking about. So, physicians across America, surgeons across America are treated for medical disease by medical therapeutics all the time. And if a patient, in this case a surgeon, can be benefited from a medical therapeutic, then there should be no reason to prevent that from happening. But the question gets gray when we're talking about what's the therapeutic, right? And so if the treatment in question is medical cannabis in the state of, or in the country of Australia, it's considered to be a legitimate medical treatment by their regulatory authorities, I say go do it, right? If I have heart disease and I could have a heart attack during surgery, I should take an antihypertensive. We know that's a drug and it can treat my thing, or my condition. There should be no reason to regulate me whether I take, whether I take that antihypertensive medication or not, because it is a drug that's been regulated and it's authorized for the treatment of my condition. So in the case that you bring out, a surgeon who may have a tremor due to Parkinson's, that is what we would call a medical condition. If the treatment of using medical cannabis is a legitimized drug therapeutic that is used for that condition, then I think that would be a great advance in the way we treat that. But it's the question of what is the category of the treatment. I think that's the big question.
So for the sake of time, as we're winding down on this panel session, and I think that there's been some great interaction during our social between the presentations, I'm just going to go down the row of the panel here and ask each of them to give us some closing thoughts. And we'll conclude this session and go into our break before the next one. So Kaitlyn, would you want to start on this one?
Okay. I just kind of listening to everything and all the comments coming from people here in the room, but what happened to autonomy? Like, I want to be able to have the choice to put whatever it is I want in my body. I also feel like this also relates to what we're going through right now with COVID. There's a lot of people that don't want to go and get the shot. They have their choice to do that, right? And so I feel that as an athlete, as a person now stepping outside of the athlete, now I'm a coach, I'm a therapist, I feel that people should have that autonomy to be able to choose what they want to put in their body and how it can help them.
Dr. Borsa? Oh, all right, good. A couple fans out there.
I thought this was a great session, and hearing from all the different people, different sides. Speaking as an academician, researcher, I was just thinking back, how do I educate my students, and how do I go about it? And like I said before, I just started to talk about the endocannabinoid system and how cannabis can be used. But I have to be able to, there has to be evidence to be able to say, like we were talking about, if you take this, this is what's going to happen to you, and So I can teach to my students, and I can give them my opinion and maybe some of the other evidence that I know of, but I think we really have to, in order to be able to have this in our journal articles and then into our textbooks and then into the magazines, we really need to have the evidence. And I think that we're moving in that direction, and I'm excited to be part of that process.
I think, for me, what boils down to is that my job is to help people perform better. And so whether that's recovery from an injury or recovery from pain, my job is to help them achieve those goals. And so some people want to take a Celebrex or a Mobic, and I think that can be a fine choice. And a lot of people, I work with a lot of Europeans and a lot of Canadians who might have a little bit of a different perspective and have grown up in a little bit of a different medical community. And a lot of people say, I don't want to take a pill. I'm not a pill guy. I don't want to take a pill. Is there something else I can do? And so, people have been asking for a while about products like, again, more in my space, more the cannabinoid products. And, it's been really beneficial for me to learn about them and about that space and about how that can help people. And so there's some education that that I do, and the dissemination of information both to our players and to their families oftentimes, and then it's it's grassroots, right? That's another cannabis joke, grassroots. And so and then the coaches come in and they say, I'm on, I can't sleep because I'm so stressed out because the power play sucks. And so, okay, well, there's some ways that we can address that, and so I think for me this has been a very a very significant learning experience for me, both to be part of this, but also just to kind of dip my toe into the water of this space, because I think there's so many ways that we can help people, and that, again, for me in the performance enhancement or the performance elevation space, I want to make them feel better, I want to make them perform better, and I want to be able to provide them answers to their questions.
Thanks. I want to thank, again, the invitation to come and speak on this important topic and represent the perspective of the American Medical Association and the physicians it represents. It's important. We didn't really talk about legalization and things like that, but it is an important comment to make that while the AMA does not support broad-scale legalization of cannabis per se, that's largely because we see cannabis as potential medical therapeutic, and as such, it should be going through the standard regulatory pathways, which we spent a lot of time talking about from a safety and efficacy standpoint. And so in that regard, it's a strong support for the new legislation that's coming out to help open up research and get to some of the answers, even though they may not be complete, but certainly more answers than we have today. And I'd also want to point out the fact that states who have legalized marijuana use and cannabis use have made tens of billions of dollars on the industry as part of their taxation and other things. But it's important to recognize that very little of that money has ever been earmarked for the scope of public health. And so it's a worthwhile advocacy part for an organization and conferences like this to talk to that issue, is that while it's legal in many states and many people are making money on it, and the states are certainly making money on it, it would behoove us to get to some of the answers by getting greater state support and earmarking some of those billions of dollars to public health research. The other thing specific to this conference when it comes to athletes, we recognize that athletes really play a very special and important function within society. They're role models. There are people who speak to lots of different populations, add and inspire to people's lives. And I think that role also brings a lot of responsibility. And when it comes to the endorsement and or use of cannabis, the audiences oftentimes can be influential to our youth. And I think that as we think about that, how we take that social responsibility and recognize the messages that we send should be, backed by the scientific community, supported by the physicians, supported by the athletic trainers in concert, so that it's not kind of a wild one-off, endorsement because it's sexy and new, but because it's actually potentially something that can be very helpful. And then finally, I'd say this is to our folks in industry and things like that, is that as we look at supporting greater industry efforts in the world of cannabis, we have taken a very strong stance on the world of equity, looking at our diversity, and we would encourage industry to also recognize the movement toward health equity, social justice, and pushing and supporting these ideas of expungement of criminal records for legal acts that are today for past acts that were illegal then. We're doing our part on the medical community to continue to push that, so that as we get more literature on cannabis, as it becomes more and more accepted and or legal in states, it shouldn't be a detriment for someone wanting to become someone in the medical profession. As currently, as you know, if you have a criminal record, it becomes very difficult to get into the medical system. So we would support expunging those records where states and other groups have made that illegal, or have subsequently made it legal. Thanks.
Fantastic comments. Let me close this session with just a couple of quick points. I would agree with the investment in some of the revenue coming back to allow those of us doing research to help justify the very statements that people are making and claims. And so anybody here, if you're successful revenue generating and you'd like to gift some funds for research, my cell number is. Paul, I'm sure you're open and receptive to this as well. But in all seriousness, to be honest with you, we do have some really good players in the industry, and they offer research dollars, and sometimes we have to turn them down because we know, honestly, we can't do that study, and we would be, just be a bad player if we took your money and then found out it wasn't going to go through a successful study. But there are some folks out there that are truly in it for the right reasons and want to help and want to move forward. Just one more quick piece. If you saw your agenda today, you may be wondering where is Mike James on this panel. Kevin was substituting today. He's not nearly as athletically prowess as Mike was, but I believe he's coming tomorrow. Is that correct, Anna? So we just had a change in the schedule. So Mike will be here tomorrow. We'll hear another tremendous perspective from an athlete, if I'm not mistaken, the first in the NFL that proposed a TUE exemption, and so we're looking forward to hearing that story. So thank you for the great comments and questions. Thank you, panelists. Outstanding information to share. We will come back and reconvene here at 10:30. So we have a little bit of break. Please visit the exhibitors who have supported this, and we really appreciate your support. And thank you all for a successful morning session.
Great job. Nice to meet you too. Yeah.